We are the Knoxville History Project, and our mission is to research, preserve, and promote the history and culture of Knoxville, Tennessee. Again, this program, or this driving tour, actually is kind of one of our last deliverables for this federal grant that we got from the city and Department of the Treasury through the Arts and Culture Alliance. So thanks to everyone involved allowing us to do this past 4 months and these driving and walking tours. That's it for me tonight. I'm going to hand it over to Jack, and take it away, Jack.
All right, thanks, Paul. Yeah, well, welcome everybody. We're grateful that you came out to talk about Fountain City. We've learned a lot about Fountain City. I've written some about Fountain City over the years. I did a long piece for Metropulse a long time ago called An Afternoon in Fountain City, and learned a lot about it then. And in this recent project to make a driving tour, we've learned even more. And we're grateful especially to Nicole Stahl. She's, of course, enables all of our Zooms, and I should thank her every time we do one. But she was especially helpful with this one because she lives in Fountain City and has more of a sense of where things are and what people call what than I do. But we had a good time looking into the history of Fountain City, and Fountain City, I think, is a place that's spread out enough and has steep areas and has a lot of high traffic areas. It's got an amazing amount of diversity in one patch of land. But that makes it a challenge for walking tours. So we thought this would be a great subject for a driving tour. And at the hazard of adding more to Fountain City's traffic, we came up with one, and it's been out for a few days now. And maybe you might have seen it already. But I wanted to talk about that. We have a great image to begin with to show kind of the ideal of Fountain City. And this is what people thought of in the 1890s in Knoxville when they thought of Fountain City, a very quiet, clean place where people would come out and relax and contemplate and just enjoy the beauty of the water and the natural environment there. Fountain City was, on one hand, of course, a lot of the communities around Knoxville began as farming communities, and there were farmers in Fountain City early on. But Fountain City's history is unique in one respect, in that it was considered a resort. There were other resorts, but I think all of Fountain City was kind of developed around a resort in a way that very few other resorts actually spawned a community. But this was it began in the early 1800s. Even it was such a clean, beautiful place that people churches would go there to have their camp meetings in the summertime. And not many of us remember the camp meeting era, but it was a time when people would go out for revivals. They would usually have a big tent. They would go into the big tent and they would sing hymns and hear an enthusiastic, perhaps, oration, a sermon, and they would all feel more energized in their faith than they had been before. And that was one of the first attractions of Fountain City, a particular kind of tourism, if you want to look at it that way. But because of that, it was well known for that. People thought, well, there's secular tourism as well. And by 1890, there was an interest in building a Fountainhead Hotel. Now, the reason it's called Fountainhead is that there actually is a place where the water comes out of the side of Black Oak Ridge to form this tributary of First Creek. And that place where the water comes out is called the Fountainhead. Here's an 1895 map. Okay, here's the map of Fountain City, and or this is a map of the whole Knox County, and this is kind of just a detail of Fountain City. But there, it's interesting to look at. It's got the ridge on the top there. I was surprised it's called. It looks like it's Sharp's Ridge. It's called McAnally's in this one. But you see the Smithwood Post Office and the Beverly Post Office. Beverly on the north and Smithwood on the south, but Fountain City over farther to the west. But that was Fountain City in that tight grid of streets was right around very near where the duck pond, aka Fountain City Lake, is. Litton's and all that is over there. And you might notice it says Holbrook Normal College. That was a teacher's college that was up there by where the hotel was. Anyway, and there are a few interesting things we'll see in further detailed shots of this map. But back to that picture we had of the hotel, Paul. Let's look at that one again. Yeah, this is a pretty rare picture of the old Fountainhead Hotel as it was in the 1880s and 90s and very early 1900s. This was a kind of a resort area. The Fountainhead Hotel was located very close to where Gresham Middle School is today. The Fountain City Lake or pond was actually built as a sort of accessory, as a amenity to the Fountainhead Hotel. This heart-shaped lake that was there by 1890 or so. So this was a place where people would come from Knoxville, Fountain City, because of Sharp's Ridge and the fact that Fountain City didn't have any real industry. It was considered cleaner and fresher and quieter and more beautiful than anywhere in Knoxville. Knoxville by the 1890s was getting very, very smoky, coal smoke from factories and also from people's houses. But Fountain City tended to be very clean not only naturally, environmentally, but morally clean. They were careful that there was not access to saloons in Fountain City during this time. But it was kind of a place to go away, rest and reflect and refresh, both for Knoxville proper, but also for people from other states would come to Fountain City and just take a week or two or take the whole summer and spend it in Fountain City. Let's look at another one, Paul. There are a few remnants of that era, and I'm glad that this is still there. I think this was the beauty that was attractive to people 200 years ago. This brook or this little part of a creek, that runs through and eventually forms kind of a tributary of First Creek. Again, it flows out of the side of the hill, and this is very fresh water, fresh from the underground, very clear water, unlike a lot of First Creek. But it flows through the park, and I think it's just very well kept, very well loved by the community. You see on the sign it says maintained by Fountain City Lions Club. That arrangement has changed recently, but we can thank and it's now an official Knoxville City Park. But we can thank the Fountain City Lions Club, who've kept it for decades and decades as a really beautiful park. I think that for my money, the most attractive park in Knoxville is the Fountain City Park, and just a great place to spend an afternoon with your kids or reading a book or whatever. It's just a lovely spot. But this was the attraction. The waters of the Fountainhead were refreshing, if not medicinal. I've never heard any medicinal claims for these waters, but it was part of the reason that they built the Fountain City Hotel, Fountainhead Hotel in that time. By the way, Fountainhead would have been the name for it if not for the fact that there's another town in Tennessee called Fountainhead by this time. And when they started, they decided to have a post office there. I thought there was enough people there for a post office that they said, what else going to call it? And they said, well, how about Fountain City? I think that word had been around in some lips before that, but it became better known as Fountain City than Fountainhead in the 1890s. Next one. All right, here's the earliest settler we know of was John Adair, and they call this a fort. It's sometimes called a station. I haven't found references to it historically as Adair Fort or Fort Adair, as some people call it, but I think by the early 20th century, people were looking back and retrospectively calling it that. But it was basically a fortified settlement of John Adair, who was one of the more interesting of the early settlers in Knox County. A lot of his business was in Knoxville proper. He was founder of the Presbyterian Church in Knoxville and lots of other things. but he was a delegate, one of four Knox County or five Knox County delegates to the State Constitutional Convention in 1796 that founded the state of Tennessee. So John Adair of Fountain City can be called a co-founder of the state of Tennessee. Well, what made him different from the other delegates there was that he was from Ireland. He had an Irish accent. He'd spent his youth and early adulthood in Ireland, so he came over here fully an Irish guy, but was settled here and was what is considered kind of the founder of Fountain City. And this is purely an artist's speculative depiction of his place, which was kind of in the southern part of Fountain City, very near Sharps Ridge, along Broadway. There's actually we have a marker about where his fort was. Next one, please. We'll see it soon if it's not the very next one. Okay, and something else Fountain City is known for in those early days of the 1890s was the dummy line. It's kind of a funny name for a train, but it was a steam train, not an electric streetcar, but it acted like an electric streetcar. It ran a kind of regular route every day, back and forth, from downtown Knoxville. It actually took off from the Emory Place area of downtown Knoxville, near Old Gray Cemetery, and would chug all the way up to Fountain City and let people off about where Hotel Road is today. Of course, Hotel Road is named for the Fountainhead Hotel. They called it there are speculations about why they called it a dummy line. One was that it didn't appear to have an engine or like a head. It was like a headless train. But it was designed, the story goes, to not scare horses. And I don't know if that was a problem with a lot of trains and a lot of early streetcars. But anyway, that's I don't know whether it succeeded at that or not, but it was a kind of a popular amenity for 15 years, and then it was replaced by the electric streetcar that ran back and forth between Knoxville and Mountain City. A good question about how long the train trip took. I think it was about half an hour or so. I have read accounts of how long it took. It was not a fast trip. They did a little snaking around to get from downtown Knoxville to Fountain City, but it was very popular, a very popular route, and people would load up on the train. They would actually have extra trips on holidays, especially 4th of July and Labor Day. Basically, the outdoor holidays were the ones that we celebrated at Fountain City, and Fountain City, literally thousands of people would come from Knoxville on the trains that kept going and going and going all day to Fountain City on the dummy line, and later the streetcars. Next one, please. All right, here's old Holbrook Normal College. This building's not there anymore, but it was this was the college that was built in the 1890s. That was a teacher's college, and it was considered a very progressive college at the time, and was considered a great feather in the hat for Knox County to have this teacher's college with a well-known reputation out of some progressive educators in Ohio had founded the first Holbrook College, and then established one here in Knoxville. It lasted only a few years, but it seems to have had an effect, because a few teachers who became well known, especially in Knox County schools, were graduates of Holbrook Normal College. It was located very close to where the Fountain City Lake and all that is today, right in that kind of the downtown section of Fountain City. And at one time, the old hotel, after it had gone out of business, was used as a dormitory for Holbrook. Next one, please. All right, this is a little bit later in our time, some of our times at least. But this was when, in 1962, Fountain City had always been proudly or thought of itself as independent of Knoxville, even though it didn't have much industry, if any. It was annexed in 1962, and many people were kind of playfully grief-stricken about this. and they had a sort of a mock funeral through downtown Fountain City along Broadway, to talk about our beloved Fountain City. Interestingly, kind of ironically, despite the name, Fountain City, unlike several parts of Knoxville, including Fort Sanders, never had its own government. So it was never really a city. It was always just a community. And whether it was the largest unincorporated community is kind of a moot question, because if you're not incorporated, you don't know how big your community is. Really, you don't have boundary lines. But that was how Fountain City thought of itself for a long time. We're proud that they were not incorporated, and then suddenly they were incorporated in 1962, along with Bearden and lots of other. In fact, the city had a massive incorporation that included a lot of areas that had been suburban or rural before 1962. Next one, please. All right, here's Lyndhurst Cemetery, established in 1922. An interesting place to walk around. If you haven't, you might, if you do walk around Lyndhurst, you might find some surprises. People of some national reputation. A lot of Fountain Cityans, of course, are buried here. But there are over the years some interesting surprises. One is, of course, Billy Meyer, the famous baseball manager for the Pittsburgh Pirates, is buried there. He was from Knoxville, spent most of his time, almost all of his career away from Knoxville, but came back here to be buried when he died in the late 50s. But another even more surprising one is a guy named James Pope, who was a senator from Idaho and one time mayor of Boise, who's buried at Lyndhurst. And why is he in Knoxville? Because late in his career, he was hired to be one of the directors of the Tennessee Valley Authority. And he and his wife decided they liked Knoxville better than Boise. So they ended up settling here and settling here for eternity even. So, but it's an interesting place to walk around. It's not very far from Sharps Ridge on the kind of southern part of Fountain City, just off Broadway. Next one. Here's the Adair oak. I think one of the oldest trees in Fountain City, right on the edge of Adair of the Lyndhurst Cemetery. And I'm told that the Adairs are buried at this spot. I don't think their graves were originally marked, but they were marked later. I think next picture we may have a picture of that. Yeah. This is John Adair didn't live in a time when we had federal markers. So this is like a Civil War style marker, but as you see, it says Revolutionary War. He was a veteran of the American Revolutionary War, and got a federal marker for that some 100 years or so after his death, I think. But that's now I don't know if they know for sure if that's exactly the place he's buried, but I think it's close. Next one, please. And here's the ceremony about establishing those kind of unveiling the tombstones of John Adair and Edward Smith in 1926. Yeah, by the DAR. Next one, please. All right, and here's a dedication of a marker. This is the site of Fort Adair. That was here. His place is, as I say, I've never seen a mention of it as Fort Adair in early documents, but by the 20s, people thought of it that way. So that's and it was sort of a fort. Next one, please. We have a later picture of it, don't we?
Yeah, Jack, and this is really the first kind of stop on the tour, right? Before getting going on Broadway.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the driving tour. Yeah, here we go. And this is that same marker in a very different context today. It's not surrounded by green grass and trees anymore, but it's right on a busy commercial strip. But that was put there. And here's also a state historical marker. So Adair was an interesting and important fellow, and again an Irishman. We don't always think of our of our founders as having Irish accents, but he was actually, fresh off the boat, more or less. Next one, please. All right, this is one of the first, I guess, buildings that we have on the tour, and this is the Dempster Francis House on Broadway at the corner of Gibbs, and it's been known as the George Dempster House for a long time. But George Dempster, the mayor and city manager, who also invented the Dempster dumpster, lived there for only 4 or 5 years, right before his famous invention, and that went around the world with a variation of his name on it. He introduced the word dumpster to the world in 1937. But anyway, that house is a especially lovely place with some kind of porticos and things. You can walk out on that little balcony on the left side, and they've got the original bathrooms, tile bathrooms, and so forth. But it's a 1920 house. It was also the home to the Francis family, and I was enjoyed finding out that that one of the most famous people who ever set foot in that house, besides George Dempster, was the guy who wrote Dial M for Murder, the movie, which became a well-known movie, and also Wait Until Dark, two really kind of famous movies of suspense and horror. He was an Englishman who married into the Francis family of Knoxville, and he was feted there with some society occasion in the early 1950s, not long after his wedding. And unlike a lot of Hollywood marriages, that wedding lasted for decades. Next one, please. Yeah. All right, and down the street, just down Gibbs, a little jag down Gibbs, is the home of a former board member of ours, Nelda Hill, but it was the former home of Carlos Campbell, who was head of the Knoxville Chamber of Commerce. Oh, by the way, yeah, as Laura mentions, the Dempster House is for sale, and I think the last I heard, it's almost just under $1 million, and it's yours. But it's surprisingly, and got a nice big yard. We're talking again about the Dempster House. A nice big yard, and it's quiet in the house, even though Broadway is right out there. So if you want a historic home, you can buy one. But back to the Carlos Campbell house, that much smaller, more modest house down Gibbs Drive. Carlos Campbell was the head of the Chamber of Commerce in Knoxville, but also a great hiker and lover of the Smoky Mountains. I think we consider him one of the co-founders of the Smoky Mountains National Park movement, and the guy that wrote the book about it. He wrote The Birth of a National Park, and I think he wrote it probably in that house, the best early history of the Smoky Mountains. That we kind of use as a reference to how, by someone who actually was there and remembered all the people who put it together. But he lived in that house for half a century or more, and that was really his home for a very long time. But an interesting fellow. Paul has written a sort of monograph about him that you can read online or in our last collection of stories, Knoxville Lives 4, I think, right, Paul? But a guy whose name should be remembered. All right, next one, please. All right, this is not here anymore. I'm sorry to say. This was a house beloved by everyone who drove by it. This was an circa 1890 house, and this was called Park Place, and it was a house built by an early developer of Fountain City. But this was, see if I can catch up with my notes here. But it was owned by this guy for a fairly short time, and it actually went through the hands of several major business executives, coal people, and so forth over the years. And the last people to own it in the 1980s really were hoping that they could sell it to someone who could save it, and were trying to sell it because they didn't think any family would need a house that big. They were trying to sell it as a restaurant at one time, and it they didn't get any good takers. It was bought by one chain store who owned it for just a few years, who tore it down for their parking lot, and then closed their store later on, and sold the property to Kroger, which is where it is now. But one of the best Victorian era houses ever built in Knoxville is Park Place, and had a lot of amazing stonework and woodwork inside. And unlike some Victorian houses, it had some kind of Art Nouveau touches to it, some kind of modern aspects, stylish aspects to it. Yeah, I'm sorry I don't remember. I'm sure I drove by that house a long time ago, but I don't remember it. But it's worth remembering anyway, and remembering where it was. Next one, please. All right, here's another historic house in Fountain City, and there are lots of really historic houses. Yeah, as Mr. David Martin mentions, it was a Target. I was trying to remember which chain store bought it, but it was a Target for just a few years, and they finally and they closed the Target store. It happens all the time. A major chain store will buy a place, tear it down, change the spot forever, and then decide, oh, we want to go somewhere else, and that's what Target did. Anyway, but there are lots of historic houses around Fountain City, and one of the for people who appreciate historic homes, it's not an easy place to visit. It's not like Charleston or somewhere you can walk around and see these houses. Many of them are hard to see, and some of them are on roads where the traffic is pretty fast. This one's you can see as long as you keep driving along Cedar Lane. But the Carnes house was built around 1899 or so for a guy named Carnes, who was a saddler, originally had a shop on Market Square, but later built a bigger business out of it, and was involved in real estate too, and was a major landowner in this area. And as Nicole mentions, this house is also for sale. So you could, if you have a lot of money, you can buy two of Fountain City's most historic houses, and keep one for a summer home and one for a winter home if you want to. But anyway, it's a nice house to just drive by and visit. There was an attempt to make a kind of a bed and breakfast of it in the 1890s, and then it became kind of an event venue, and kind of they ruffled a lot of feathers in the neighborhood when they began calling it Magnolia Manor, I think, kind of playing up the kind of the southern charm of it. But it was there was they finally gave up on that. I think it's now being marketed as a residence again. Next one, please. All right, here's Fountain City Lake, aka the Duck Pond, in a very early shot of it. You might say it maybe looks better now. It has more of a kind of a classic look today, but of course it does attract ducks and surprisingly fishermen. I remember being astonished. I spent some time just hanging around there back 20 years ago or so when I wrote that piece for Metropolis, and was really surprised by how many fishermen were fishing in there, and they were catching real fish, even big fish. I don't know how they do this, but I know they do stock it. The TWRA does stock the pond with trout. But the fish I remember them catching were big catfish, and I just was awestruck by that. But it's a charming place to just kind of hang around, and there are people sometimes work on their cars while they're parked by there. But here's a picture of it in kind of a more idealistic sort of view, and that's the shot we opened with. And but they called it Fountain City Lake to begin with, which began to sound more awkward as the years went by, when we began building TVA began building really big lakes like Norris Lake and Fort Loudon Lake. That people I think preferred to call it the Duck Pond. And here's some of the famous ducks of the Duck Pond, and the fountain, which when I was a kid I thought this was the fountain that Fountain City was named for, but I think it's kind of a metaphorical fountain that they put in to suggest the name of the community. I'm glad they did, but it's kind of like how they planted magnolias on Magnolia Avenue, which was actually named for a woman. But those fountains kind of suggest the name of the community. Next one, please. And I'm really glad we have that one remnant of the hotel. And here's Hotel Avenue by an early kind of a depiction of how it looked to people who just got off the dummy line. I'm glad to say some of it's still intact. The old kind of downtown section of Hotel Avenue or Road is still there. I did some research recently and found out the name of that you see depicted on one of the buildings with a date of 1923. And I'm trying to remember the name. It does not sound like anything but an American name, but it was actually the shop of a Bulgarian immigrant who sold. He was a confectioner. He had ice cream and baked goods, but also sold radios. Was one of the first radio salespeople in Fountain City. Anyway, but you would find almost anything here. I missed the creamery used to be along Hotel Road, and but there were several, probably 100 businesses have been there over the years. It's right across the street from Fountain City Park, and that on the right is the old station for the dummy line, and later the Fountain City streetcar. Next one, please. All right, and here's right in that area too, right on Hotel is the old early 1960s library, which was converted into the Fountain City Art Center when they built the big new Fountain City Library, about a mile or so away. But that's right on the edge of it. They have art classes in there. They have art exhibits in there. It's if you got some time on your hands and always wanted to try something artistic, it's a good place to go. Next one, please. All right, here's Gresham Middle School as it's known today, or as it was known when it was built in 1931. This is old Central High School, as it was when it was first built there. Actually, Central High had been around for a little bit, but the first time they had built a big permanent school was up here. And a lot of people who went to Central High in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s remember this as their school. Central moved away in 1971 when they built their new modern school. But then fortunately, and I wish this happened more often, they kept using this good school building often. And we just seen this happen recently when they just tore down Rural High because they really hadn't, I don't think had explored very aggressively many other uses for that good building. This school has been saved and is still being used as a school, and I'm glad there was that need that kept it in place. So this building is almost 97 years old or so, and it's appears to be in good shape. So I'm glad it may have another century or two in it. Next one, please. And here's Nanny Lee Hicks, who taught in that school. And a lot of what we know about Fountain City and about Knoxville is thanks to this lady who was kind of an iconic history teacher to many kids who went to Central High. She had a habit of assigning her students to do original research and interview people and go out and find out about parts of their community in Fountain City, but also in other parts of Knoxville. And believe it or not, when we did some historical research on the old Reynolds house on Bearden Hill, we found out that one of Nanny Lee Hicks's students had interviewed some people who had never been interviewed before, who had lived in that house. And this was back in the 1930s that they did this. And we used that information from these teenage interviewers to help kind of flesh out what we could learn about who lived in that house and what it was like there. But she was a great idol of the late Dr. Jim Tumblin, a good friend of Knoxville History Project, and but he was a great admirer of hers, and had wrote about her in his book, Fountain City People Who Made a Difference, and she certainly was one of those. Next one, please. And by the way, we have copies of that book, which was published by Celtic Cat, which is run by Brent Minchie and Laura Still, who are here with us tonight. It's a great book about historic people of Fountain City. All right, this is Litton's, one of the, I guess, better known old restaurants in Knoxville. It was, a lot of people assume it's much older than it is. It was established there in the 1970s, although they had a kind of a relationship with a previous butcher business that had been around since the 50s, I believe. But Litton's has become kind of famous for their hamburgers. The Thunder Road Burger used to be one of my favorites, but is a gathering place. I think probably the most popular gathering place in Fountain City today. Next one, please. Okay, this is an interesting story, and that we found out more about. I'd heard of this guy, and the guy we're talking about is the third guy from the right, whose name was Copeland. What was his first name?
John.
John I. Copeland. That's right. But he was a fellow who ran a service station on Broadway near Garden Street. And that doesn't sound very remarkable, but it was a remarkable service station. He was a former teacher and also a sometime actor and orator. An interesting fellow to be an auto mechanic in the 1920s and 30s, in the days when a lot of people were using Broadway, as a national part of a national road, part of the Dixie Highway, to come through Tennessee to go to from Chicago to Florida or wherever. But he had this service station there and did okay with this service station. But it wasn't just a service station. It was the only service station I know of that ever had a lending library in it. And he specialized in scientific books. He had a library of scientific books in his library. He also, another thing that made him unusual was that he kept his hunting dogs in there. I think there were foxhounds that were in the. They lived in the shop, and so did he. He lived in the shop himself. He didn't need another house. He lived on a board planks on a couple of sawhorses, and that was where he slept. But he's lived there, and he's remembered, and he's worth looking up and learning about. I'm not sure I would have known about him if not for the fact that he was a major inspiration to another young man who I think his picture is next. Paul. This is Roy Acuff, probably the most famous person from Fountain City, the fiddler, singer, who kind of made country music a national phenomenon. Country music had been kind of a niche thing. It was a nostalgic thing for people before the 1930s. Roy Acuff really made it this kind of real, visceral, modern, fresh, aggressive thing. Roy Acuff was a Central High grad. He was from Maynardville originally, but by the time he was 15 or 16, his family had moved to Fountain City. His dad was both a lawyer and a Baptist preacher, interestingly. But they settled in Fountain City. Roy went to Central High and quickly became the king of all sports. He was a football star. He was a basketball star, and he was especially a baseball star. He loved baseball more than anything else. He was known to be very aggressive. The first 100 times that Roy Acuff's name appears in Knoxville newspapers is as a sports champion, as a teenager at Central High. He was that well known, but he was considered kind of intimidating. He looks very friendly in the picture, but he was an aggressive, intimidating competitor. But after high school, and this happens to a lot of guys who are kind of high school heroes, he graduated high school, I think, at the age of 20. And what do you do next to stay in if you're enjoying the kind of glory of high school days? What do you do next? Well, Roy got in trouble a lot. He got in trouble smuggling liquor during Prohibition. He got in trouble for gambling, and on a couple of occasions, he got in trouble for assault. And in at least one occasion, he was shot. And this is something that's not in any of his biographies, but he was shot and wounded in a bootlegger joint on Hotel Road, right, that we were just talking about. A place called the Green Lantern, and that was in around 1930 or 31. But during this time, he began hanging out with John Copeland, the guy whose picture we just saw. And Roy Acuff came from a musical family. He knew how to play some instruments, but had never really applied himself. He opted to try to go into Major League Baseball, and there are stories that he was being scouted by the Yankees and so forth. But he had a terrible misfortune, and that he began having a series of heat strokes, and realized that he just had a condition that he could not stay out in the hot weather very much. So what can he do inside? Well, he can play the fiddle. And but he learned some fiddle. He was hanging out with John Copeland, who was just kind of an eccentric too, as Roy Acuff was in a way. But they began hanging out together, and John Copeland began showing Roy Acuff some new licks on the fiddle. He knew how to play fiddle too. He also had a sense of stage presence and the idea of presenting yourself on stage. And in a fairly short time, Roy Acuff was performing in public, and by 1932 had performed in a talent show at the Tennessee Theater. But by 1935, he was really a local star on the radio, on WNOX especially, and well, actually he went back and forth from WNOX to WROL as one offered them more money and then more money again. He was getting a following here in Knoxville, and did just it was almost revolutionary. A lot of the country stars, we look back in retrospect, were kind of under the radar. Dolly Parton, as talented as she was as a kid, really wasn't talked about very much when she was performing on the radio in her early days. Chet Atkins was mentioned a few times, not very often, but Roy Acuff was kind of a phenomenon in radio in Knoxville by 1935, 36, 37. And especially when he added the dobro to his band, and that kind of made him nuclear in a way. It was just suddenly was this surprising band, the Crazy Tennesseans they were called. And eventually they went to Chicago and cut a record, cut a song that they had picked up in Knoxville called "The Gray Speckled Bird," which was the first kind of pop song to have dobro in it. And that was made him a phenomenon, and the Grand Ole Opry enlisted him, and he went to Nashville, and because of their giant radio tower there, and the rest is history. I think Roy Acuff did as much to invent Nashville as Music City as anyone. But he began this at John Copeland's garage on Broadway near Garden Drive there, back in the late 1920s, when he was a kind of dejected young former athlete and semi-criminal in those days. But anyway, a fascinating story that I wish Ken Burns had told in his country music documentary. Next one, please. All right, and here's not far from John Copeland's place. In fact, John Copeland was still running his place when Arthur Savage, who was an English immigrant, English industrialist who came here and with his brother were manufacturing major earth-moving equipment and stuff like that, especially down the Second Creek Valley. But he made some money and began, I think this is one of 3 gardens that he made that Arthur Savage created in East Tennessee, and I think the best preserved of them, as far as I know. It was built around 1915, between 1915 and 1920, and built with this Asian theme, which was very stylish at the time, using kind of Japanese pagoda type forms and other aspects that kind of made people think of the Far East, and built this just as a private garden, and it was kind of something that people came out and gawked at in those days. But it was hit hard by a tornado in the late 30s and kind of uh, went into kind of a lapse of some years when it was overgrown and wasn't that taken care of very well. Arthur Savage died, but for some years it was just kind of a remnant, a ruin of its former self, until the folks who run the current Montessori school next door to it began working on it and fix it up, and they maintain it. And they use it for their school today. It's not open to the public on a regular basis, but it's you can see it pretty clearly from the road, and it's worth a drive by, certainly. Next one, please. All right, here's the modern Central High that was built in 1971 on a very, very, very modern design, very different from their previous place. I think designed by Barbara Murray at that time, but they're certainly a major school. Central High was it's kind of surprising they're called that, because it was a county school, and it was, of course, it was in the northernmost part of the county, almost northernmost part, this side of Halls. But this was it was a county school for people who lived in different parts of the county that didn't have access to a county high school. So some people came to Central High all the way from South Knoxville, that's always been puzzling to me for a long time, because you read about people who live in Vestal, and they would go all the way to Central High School to go to high school. But that was the way the county school system was set up back when we had separate city and county systems. And Central, I think, was the best regarded of all the county high schools in those days. But next one, please. All right, here's an interesting kind of a detail of that county map we were talking about, showing Beverly and Smithwood. Beverly is just a little bit north of Smithwood, and this is interesting because the lady we were just talking about, the teacher, I'm somehow not finding the names in the order. I'm sorry, what?
Nanny Lee Hicks.
Yeah. And was it Hetty? What was her first name? Nanny Lee Hicks. Yeah. But she said, she makes a very clear statement that in her opinion there was no difference between, he said, Beverly is Smithwood and Smithwood is Beverly, and I think perhaps earlier there might have been more of a distinction between the two, but it's interesting to see them depicted on a map very close together, but as different places. By the way, that track has been puzzling to historians for a long time. That there was a horse racing track. I've found only one or two references to it. It was there in the 1890s. It may not have been there much longer than that. We don't know much of anything about it. It was one of 7 or 8 known horse racing tracks in Knox County, including one in Concord, and of course the famous Cal Johnson track, which was on the east side of town after it was on the southern waterfront. But that Beverly track, as Ron Allen, the historian, used to refer to it, has been a bit of a mystery. It may have been just known to the people who lived near it. Next one, please. Okay, John Smith was a relative of John Adair. I think he was a grandson-in-law, and he was considered one of the early settlers of Fountain City, and the guy for whom Smithwood is named. We just thought we'd show that picture of this fellow who lived most of the 19th century. Next one, please. All right, here's the Smithwood area when it had Baum's greenhouses, and we learned a lot about Baum's when we researched and wrote our historic Bearden book a couple of years ago. Baum's, of course, settled in Bearden, and that's why Baum Drive is off of North Shore in Bearden. But before they were there, they had the greenhouses up in Smithwood, and the Baum family were Germans. They were refugees from the political chaos in Central Europe in the 19th century, and the family is still thriving here in Knoxville today. But their first big greenhouse was right there, right in what we now know as Fountain City. Next one, please. All right, here's what they call the Smithwood Corner. This is at Jacksboro and Tazewell Pike and Sanders Drive. Another little downtown that's away from the downtown on Hotel Road. But these old houses, most a century old, or old buildings, commercial buildings, a century old or so, are still there and still used. I'm glad to see that. Yeah. All right, next one, please. All right, right across the street is Pratt's Country Store, which has been there for a few decades at least, and I think the Pratt family goes back to the 50s at least, doing similar things and not too far from here. So it's got quite a lot of a legacy with it. Next one, please. All right, this is Greenwood Cemetery, and it was founded by I'm blanking on lots of things tonight, probably because I've got this this list of things that are not exactly the Kesterson family. Dr. Kesterson, who was a dentist, and he'd had a son die in the 1890s, and thought, I need a cemetery for him, close to where I live. The son, I think, was originally buried at Old Gray, and he looked around the country for ideas for cemeteries, and was fascinated with the kind of the modern garden cemetery movement, of which Old Gray was the first articulation in Knoxville. But he was up in Brooklyn and saw the Greenwood Cemetery up there, and thought, this is a beautiful place. I want to recreate something like this down in the Fountain City area, and he did. And the first person buried there was his son, who was exhumed and reburied at Greenwood. But I think the Kesterson monument, and it's very obvious today. It's up on the hill. There it is. Yeah. Is, I think, the tallest monument in the cemetery. It was kind of a news story when he had this giant marble obelisk manufactured, and it was coming into downtown on the rail, and was discovered to have broken in the trip. And it was such a big monument that the McClung family, who were extravagant in some ways, but not were very practical about cemetery monuments, said, we'll buy that obelisk, or that shortened obelisk, and it's perfectly good enough for us. And so the McClung marker at Greenwood is the broken Kesterson marker. Kesterson had another full length obelisk established up on the top of the hill of Greenwood for him and his family, including his son. But Greenwood is the burial place of a lot of interesting, famous people, including Edward Terry Sanford is buried there, our only Supreme Court justice. And that's interesting in itself, that a Supreme Court justice is buried there. But when you think of when he was buried there, they had a lot of the other Supreme Court justices came to his funeral. So there were actually famous living Supreme Court justices, including Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes, who was there for the funeral of Judge E.T. Sanford, who was on the U.S. Supreme Court from 1923 to 1930. He died rather suddenly in Washington. Next one, please. And here's James Agee's marker, and this is not the writer James Agee, but his father, and this is the guy about whom he wrote the novel A Death in the Family, and you see the death date of May 18th, 1916. That's when Father James Agee, who was still in his 30s, was killed in a car wreck on the Clinton Pike on the up in North Knox County. But he was buried there, and this site is actually described in the novel, the one, the Pulitzer Prize in 1957, and actually names Greenwood Cemetery in the novel. It's a very moving passage when Uncle Andrew is describing the burial to the son who doesn't quite understand what death means. But this was he's buried there alone though. The family moved away after that, and none of his relatives are buried here. Next one, please. All right, another person buried here is Joseph Delaney, the African American artist who was best known for his street scenes in New York. He's the younger brother of Buford Delaney, who's somewhat more famous internationally. But Joseph Delaney was a talented writer in his own right, and as we mentioned earlier, Fred Moffat has written a book about him, which I think stands to keep his reputation in good stead. He had moved back to Knoxville, by the way, before he died, and was kind of, in fact, he had actually been in the new Knoxville Museum of Art right after it opened. Next one, please. All right, this is another African American relic. A lot of people don't think of Black people when they think of Fountain City, but there was a Black community there, and it was called the Oakland community, and it's off of just right off of Tazewell Pike near Greenwood Cemetery. It's called Oakland Drive, and it just goes up there. And this is an old school. There's an old Black school that was built, I think, in the 1920s, designed by a Frank Barber. And surprisingly, I don't think he was kin to all the other architect Barbers in Knoxville history. But this was, it's held up pretty well over the years. It's now a community center. And this is still, kind of a pocket Black community in Fountain City. Next one, please. All right, this is, there are a lot of historic houses on Tazewell Pike, and I found the problem of dealing with them. One is that a lot of them are behind foliage, and for good reason. The foliage kind of protects them from the noise of Tazewell Pike. Tazewell Pike, just in the last few years, has become a really, really busy thoroughfare in a way that I remember when it was like a country road, and you didn't worry about walking along it or crossing it. But now it's hard to drive down it, unless you're driving at the speed that everybody behind you wants you to drive. So it's really hard to get a look at the beautiful, really beautiful and historic houses that are up and down Tazewell Pike. And these are as historic houses as any on Kingston Pike. But the Richard Jackson House, for example, Richard Jackson was a railroad executive. He's the guy, not Andrew Jackson, for whom Jackson Avenue was named. But he's buried up he has had his home up in Fountain City at Tazewell Pike. Lovely old house with Victorian touches. Next one, please. And here's another house, Crawford Harrell Mansion. I think this is one of the older houses, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, it's 1858. This is an antebellum house on Tazewell Pike. It's difficult to see from the road today, but it's with the trees. But it's a kind of classic old house of its era. Next one, please. All right, here's that shot again, just showing Beverly and Smithwood. Next one, please. All right, this the Beverly Sanatorium. Is this the sanatorium that was built in 1924? I should have looked at this earlier. I don't know for sure. Paul, do we know for sure if this is the actual sanatorium? It looks older than 1924 to me. This is a more recent.
I guess the photograph was in 1924.
But I
wait a
mean,
minute. Was he gone?
the sanatorium was built in 1924, though. So it's anyway. But I can talk about the sanatorium. It was a tuberculosis sanatorium that was a subject of a great deal of fundraising passion in Knoxville in the early 1920s, and it was for people suffering from tuberculosis at a time when people thought that fresh air and good living and good food was the best medicine for TB. And there were places like this in Asheville, but not until 1924 when they built one in Fountain City, which was again the kind of the mecca of clean living, this refuge from the horrors of modern life, smoke and fumes and noise. They would have tuberculosis victims being taken care of at the Beverly Hills sanatorium, they called it at one time. But it kind of transformed over the years into after they had new treatments for tuberculosis in the early 1950s, they built a modern hospital there and called it something else, the Lung something hospital. And it kind of evolved into a retirement home, which is what's there now. Next one, please. All right, this is a lady whose work I've come to respect a lot in recent years, ever since newspapers.com and the library's Papers to Pixels project has made her work more accessible. I encourage you to go next time you have some time. If you have a library card, you can look all of our stuff up on Papers to Pixels through the public library website. But she had a column called the Country Calendar, and she was was hired first to be a writer about natural phenomena that she loved to talk about, trees and flowers and birds, in the 1920s. But over the years, she got interested in a lot of other things too, including what makes cities grow and function, including Russian literature. She got interested in lots and lots of things, and was also one of the great historians that we can read and find out about life in Knoxville. Even she was interviewing people born in 1878, but she knew people who remember the Civil War, and she knew people who knew Francis Hosmer Burnett. She knew people who remembered people from the middle of the 19th century, and she talked to them. But she's a fascinating lady, a good writer that the New Sentinel had from the 1920s to the 1950s, maybe the early 60s before she retired. But she lived up on Black Oak Ridge, and I'm sorry to say her house burned down just a few years ago. But it's up on not far from where the McClung family lived, up on Black Oak Ridge. I come on the part that's west of Broadway up there. In fact, she lives on, I think, Curtis Lane, which is named for her family. And a lot of her columns she just wrote looking at her backyard and looking at the wonderful natural scenes that she saw there. And anytime she saw an unusual bird, she would describe it. But then she would talk about something more important to her. She was I think the first person and maybe the only person at the time. Remember when John Gunther called Knoxville the ugliest city in America in 1947? A lot of people were just appalled. They say, "How dare this arrogant Yankee should call us the ugliest city in America?" And Lucy Curtis Templeton alone was the one who said, brave enough to say, "Well, he's absolutely right. We are the ugliest city in America. I've been to other cities, and we have a lot of problems here, and we're just not paying attention. We need to fix some things." And that took a lot of guts to say that in 1947. But interesting lady. Next one, please. All right, here's not far from where her house is another house that I'm sorry to say is no longer there. Many of you remember kind of the shock in the 90s when people said, "Gosh, they're tearing Belcaro down." This was considered one of the great mansions in Knoxville. It was one of the McClung family mansions, and it was built right up on the ridge, and it was. A lot of people would say, "Well, you don't really own a mansion. You'll never be invited to go to a party there, probably. It's not really yours, so why do you care about it?" Well, people did care about Belcaro because they could see it from down the hill in Fountain City. You could look up and be proud that there was this really lovely mansion up there on the hill. It was designed after an Italian villa style, and the McClungs had relatives who were in-laws who were members of Italian royalty, and so they had some connections there. They traveled to Italy frequently, but this was a lovely place, connected to some interesting people. The McClungs had made most of their money in wholesale and retail businesses downtown. But next one, please. I think we have a picture of a lady who lived there. Yeah, Ellen McClung Berry, maybe one of the most tragic stories of Knoxville history, especially among the very wealthy. She was very wealthy her whole life. She was an heiress. Her father had built Belcaro, and she grew up there. But she was she had a series of horrible things happen to her. One was that her son was had severe mental disorders, psychosis perhaps, and went berserk and on one of their family vacations and killed her mother. And they're all buried together at Greenwood together. But later on, she trusted, after her husband's death. Mr. Berry seems to be a good guy. But after her husband's death, she was taken advantage of by a young operator from Denmark, I believe. But he eventually made off with all of her money somehow, and she ended up having grown up in Belcaro, ended up living in a small apartment in Morristown or somewhere, but a smaller city. But anyway, her life is her story has been told by Barbara Aston Wash, the society writer, in a thick book called "Bless Her Heart," that came out just about 4 or 5 years ago, and she tells the kind of this gothically tragic story of Ellen McClung Berry. Next one, please. All right, and another McClung home. I think this was and Laura still mentions Ellen McClung Berry was a great supporter of the arts. I should have mentioned a lot about her. She was a close friend of Eleanor Wiley, but was kind of kept the art torch going between museums. When Knoxville lost one museum and didn't have another one yet, she and Eleanor and a few other women mainly would kind of keep art exhibits going in town. But she also was the one who pitched in money, and when it was in better times, to UT to build McClung Tower, and also to build the reopen the Bull statue, which was kind of a great feat of accomplishment to get this kind of well-known, one of only 3 copies of this well-known statue to be installed at UT. But she left a lot of good in Knoxville. But anyway, this is another. Richfield is another of the McClung family homes, and in fact, this was considered a summer cottage by McClung standards at Ridgefield, and I think it's been the subject either soon to be or recently was a Knox Heritage event was held there. Next one, please. All right, this is John Webb Green, who lived up there. He was married into the McClung family and one of the most interesting people in Fountain City history. He was a lawyer, and was, if you notice the name Webb, his partner was a cousin named Daniel Cleary Webb, who was the father of Robert Webb, who founded Webb School. But John Webb Green and his wife established the funds to create McClung Museum at UT. So they were also big investors in UT. But John Webb Green was a guy known for taking on causes without pro bono if he believed in them, and seems to have been a progressive thinking guy. He was strongly opposed to the kind of white supremacist segregationist movement of the 1950s, even though John Webb Green himself was son of a Confederate officer. But he lived up in a house on Black Oak Ridge, a nice big house, and had a chauffeur who would drive him down to the bus stop in Fountain City. He would have his chauffeur drive him down the hill to the bus stop. Then he would get on the bus, pay a quarter or whatever to take the bus downtown to go to work. He had an office in the Burwell building. And that was how he got to work. He loved public transportation, which more people did. But he rode the bus or before the trolley every day he went to work. He was a major figure in saving and preserving Fountain City Park back when it was about to be developed for residences in the early 1930s. Just did a lot for Fountain City over the years, and is a guy whose name we should remember. He went around the world a couple times, wrote a couple of travel books called Travels with a Lawyer and Other Travels with a Lawyer, and they're very funny and colorful, vividly colorful books. But another Fountain Cityan from Black Oak Ridge. Next one, please. All right, here's another from the farther east on Black Oak Ridge were Harvey and Ann Broom. Harvey Broom was probably our most famous conservationist from Knoxville. He was, although we had a lot of conservationists who were involved in saving the Smoky Mountains. He loved the Smoky Mountains, and I knew them very well. But he became better known for trying to save wilderness areas, pure wilderness areas, and was one of the co-founders in 1935 of the National Wilderness Society. And he was a very stalwart member of that group and a leader in that group for the next 30 odd years of his life. Was there when they signed the Wilderness Act in 1964 in Washington. But he was a lawyer by trade, and but was a great resourceful naturalist that was one of those people that you are kind of surprised to find was living here mostly modestly and here in Knoxville. He and his wife originally lived in an old family house, an old, like a rural style house on Broadway. And I think in the early 60s, maybe late 50s, early 60s, they actually moved the house all the way up to Black Oak Ridge, and it's still there, standing there on a quiet street, kind of in the western part of Black Oak Ridge. Next one, please. All right, Baxter Gardens is a fairly recent addition to Fountain City, and also on Black Oak Ridge. It's open only 1 month a year in April, but it's a lovely garden of flowering shrubs and statuary. Next one, please. All right, we decided to include a mention of Whittle Springs, whether people consider that part of Fountain City or not. Whittle Springs has an interesting story that kind of parallels the Fountainhead Hotel story a little bit later. Whittle Springs was another springs resort that did claim to have medicinal waters that was later disproven. But it was such a popular resort, they built a beautiful big hotel there in 1915 or so that included I think the biggest swimming pool ever built in Knoxville. I've never seen I've never heard of a bigger swimming pool than the one that was at Whittle Springs, but also a golf course. And today the golf course is all that remains of Whittle Springs. The hotel was bought by WNOX in the 1950s, and they were going to use it for broadcasting both radio and television. Well, the FCC would not let them have a television station because they were owned by Scripps, and the FCC, perhaps wisely, decided that Scripps had too much of a monopoly on the entertainment in Knoxville. Yeah, here's a postcard from this Whittle Springs hotel. This was a hotel where people would stay for a week or two or a summer, and some people actually moved in and lived there. Tennessee Williams' father lived there for a year or two after his divorce from his wife in St. Louis. But they also had big jazz band concerts, jazz orchestra concerts. Jack Teagarden, who else? A lot of the great jazz band leaders of the 30s and 40s performed at the Whittle Springs Hotel. It was out in the country, and it was kind of a pleasant place to drive to. Well, WNOX, and here's that giant pool. It's there's some pictures that make it look even bigger, but It was a very big pool that was there at the hotel, and there's been some it was open to the public, yeah, and there are some movies that were shown recently of kids going down the slides at the Willow Springs Hotel in the 1930s. Anyway, back to the story. The WNOS bought the Willow Springs Hotel. They built a state-of-the-art brand new studio for TV and radio adjacent to the hotel. It was not a success as they thought, because for one thing, they didn't get the TV license. For another thing, their old radio audiences from the midday merry-go-round days from downtown were not as willing to drive all the way out to Willow Springs at lunchtime as they, a lot of their audience downtown had been factory workers who'd come over from JFG or White Lily or somewhere else, and that they just didn't have that audience up there anymore. And also, of course, live radio was dying anyway, as people got televisions and were watching TV at home. But anyway, it's that they ended up not using the hotel. The hotel was torn down about 1964, and the swimming pool, I think, went about not too long afterwards, if afterwards at all. But I'm glad the golf course is still there, and people just, if you say Willow Springs today, the people think you're talking about the golf course. Which, by the way, was also the site of one of the first airfields in Knoxville, back when we had 3 airfields, one at Island Home, one at Sutherland Avenue, which became McGee-Tyson Airport, and the one at Willow Springs, which was at one time was vying to be the Knoxville Airport, but they decided the one at Sutherland was better for that. Okay, well, thanks everybody for joining us tonight, and you can go up to Litton's, or take a trip around Fountain City, or whatever you do, go to Fountain City Park sometime this summer. It's just the best park in town, and have a picnic or just take a walk around.